people ask me what I missed from Minnesota, I was like, color. Just color in general, missed it. So I don't know if there's any CSU grads in the room, but it's a nice place to live, but I'm glad I'm back in Minnesota. So today I'm going to talk about farm finances, which I know can be a scary thing to talk about right now just because we're not in the best situation we've been historically. But there's a lot of positive that's part of the story as well. So the title is very truthful. I'm going to talk about some of the bad things, some of the good things, and then very much the reality that we're facing right now. Whoa, 2 mics at once. Can you guys hear me okay right here? Okay, cool. And please feel free to ask questions. That one works. As we go through. So I don't know if everyone can see this comic, so I'll read it to you, but this was in, oh, see, we got one laugh already, the overachiever. This was in Agri-News around this time last year, and I thought it was appropriate for today. It says, it's a scientific breakthrough. The seed will produce less corn, thus driving up the prices. Which is all of what economics is, right? It's all about supply and demand, but the fact that we are surrounded by bags of seed right now, it seemed like appropriate. But this is sort of the reality we're facing right now. We have a lot of corn, soybeans in the market, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to move it moving forward, and that's directly affecting the prices that you guys are receiving. So what I'm going to do to start today's presentation is I'm going to talk about whole farm financials, and then I'm going to drill down into just southern Minnesota financials, specifically focusing on corn and soybeans. The other key is I'm only going to be talking about conventional production within these slides. So just keep that in the back of my mind. I know there are some organic producers in the room, so adjust accordingly. We just don't have the quantity of data in our data set in order to report any organic corn or soybeans currently. So all of the data that I'm going to be using to present today is from the FinBin database housed at the University of Minnesota. So I don't know how many of you guys are aware of the Farm Business Management Association that we have within Minnesota. It's a partnership between Minnesota State colleges and universities and the U of M. So at the U of M, we house all of the data. We work with the FBM instructors to clean it, verify it, and we want to make sure that we have valid data when we're reporting these estimates. So for me, when I work in finances, this is the data that I tend to go to on a regular basis to verify what are the current costs of production in the state. And all of this is publicly available at an aggregate level. So this is one thing I really want to emphasize. We never look at individual farm level data. We're only ever looking at those averages with a minimum of 30 farms to create that average, which is why I don't have organic numbers currently. We don't have 30 organic corn producers or soybean producers in our data set to date. So if you are a producer and you want to participate in it, that'd be great, because then I can, look at those numbers too. So right now, what you see right behind me is what the median net farm income has been for the state of Minnesota going all the way back to 1996. So the green line is what the number was, or the green bar was what was reported that year, and then that red line, we adjusted it to 2017 dollars, so you could have a comparison base. And since I knew we were in a big room, I figured I'd put some arrows up here. But I want to point out, in 2017, for our farms in Minnesota, this is across all farms, so we have livestock grouped in with crops with this specific statistic. The average our median net farm income was about $28,000 for 2017. We expect that to be lower for 2018. The last time we really experienced that was back in 2015 for our Minnesota farmers, so not that long ago. But the real story comes from the fact that prior to 2015, the last time we saw levels that low was 1998. So I previously worked at North Dakota State from 2009 to 2012, which was the best time to work in North Dakota, because farming was great, oil was great, everyone was happy in North Dakota at that point in time. But I also had producers buying $5 million lines of machinery every 2 to 3 years. A lot of my students from 2009 are facing the lowest prices. They don't ever remember having agriculture have prices this low. So we have a big subset of producers out there that this is really the first time they're facing it. There's also a subset that went through this in the 80s, so we can learn a lot from both groups to move forward. The other thing that we like to do, as economists, we like to throw a lot of numbers at you guys, right? So I'm trying to put it in more reasonable context. But what we do is we have this blue line is that median net farm income that we reported. And then what we did is I wanted to see how does it differ for the top 20% of our farms, looking at their net farm income performance, and then the lowest 20%, which is in that red line down below. And the thing that is most concerning for this figure is that gap between the red and that blue line. We see it widening really since 2008, and we want to keep an eye on that, is what is causing that bottom 20% to have that sort of bigger gap compared to what it was sort of historically prior to 2001. So, I'd like it to be this close. Why is it this far away? That's what we're looking at. So I don't know how many diversified operations are in the room, but I did want to at least show if there are a few people who have hogs or dairy, or I think, yeah, I do have beef on here, that you can at least see what net farm income variation has been since 1996. So crop producers are in the solid blue line, and in general, you're following a relatively similar pattern. As an economist, I tend to say 2008 to 2012 is sort of that anomaly, right? Everyone likes to think back and say we're going to have corn prices that occur during that time period. And the reality is right now that was sort of the anomaly. So we have to figure out what our new long-term steady state is. Our hog farms tend to have a larger fluctuation in their net farm income over time, but then our dairy and beef producers tend to be a little bit more stable. But in general, crop and hogs tend to be the highest net farm income reporters compared to beef and dairy. The other interesting stat that we like to look at is that divergence between the top 20% of our producers and that lowest 20%. So again, that's that difference with that green and that red line. The thing that we're noticing is that if you have a gross income of, let's say, less than $500,000, those top and lowest producers are pretty close together. We're not seeing a lot of differences. So that just might be a weather event. It might just be that you pre-contracted and the prices went up instead of down, so you lost out a little bit there. It's when we're getting over $1 million in gross sales that we're starting to see this divergence between our highest and our lowest producers. So our largest operations we have some really great farms, and we have some farms that are not performing as well. And we want to identify what's causing that moving forward. Is it input costs? Is it management? Is it a combination of that? And then the other figure that sort of shows how whole farm income changes across the state is we have this broken up in regions. This is how the regions are reported within the Farm Business Management Association. But if you live in Northwest Minnesota, you made, $57,000 last year in 2017, compared to Southern Minnesota, where you were around 29 to 30,000. So what do you think is causing that big difference between Northwest Minnesota versus Southern Minnesota? Yep, so rent is lower. That is a big thing that we see. It's sort of, I grew up in Stearns County, so right around the St. Cloud area, and we sort of see that difference. St. Cloud is sort of that break across. What else may be causing that? Diversity. So they have a larger quantity of crops that they're growing up there. Livestock versus crop. Actually, no, livestock actually makes the farms look worse in northern Minnesota. It's sugar beets. That was the thing that I was looking for. Sugar beets is driving a lot of this with the farms in our database in northwest Minnesota. So if you're a sugar beet producer in northern Minnesota, it's really benefited you the past few years compared to your peers even in southern Minnesota who are raising sugar beets. So the other thing that I want to emphasize is financial statements matter. The liquidity of the farms is something that we're really looking at moving forward. A farm can sustain negative income about 3 to 4 years consecutively. After that 4th year, you're going to start eating up your equity. That's when you're selling off land, selling off equipment. That's when, at least as a researcher, I get really nervous when I see multiple years in a row. So one thing that when we speak to lenders is they always want to see what is the working capital as a % of the gross revenue that you have bringing into the operation. So the beauty of being a crop producer is you tend to score really well in this area. And the reason for that is you have grain in the bin, and that inventory is valued at a market value. So in general, crop producers are on that blue line. They're traditionally around that 50%. So 50% of your working capital is connected to what your gross revenue is for that year because of that grain in the bin. Livestock producers score not as well in that area just because of the fact that they have a continuous cash flow or they don't have that long-term grain market value there. So I keep hearing, so I was born in the 80s, so I lived through the 80s with my parents on a dairy farm, but I was a small child and I didn't actually realize what was happening. But I do know that my parents started farming in 1979 and proceeded to have 5 kids in the matter of 10 years. So one can only imagine that they really figured out how to farm in the 1980s. But they also didn't pay off their farm mortgage until 2004. So it took them a while to get to that stage. But that is the key point. They have paid off their farm mortgage in 2004, and that is what this slide is really getting at. We're looking at the net worth, so that equity position of farms in our database with those green bars. So the reason why a lot of economists are not necessarily as scared as they were with the farms in the 1980s, as a large portion of the ground is now paid for in Minnesota. Not true, more so for livestock operations than crop, right? It's hard to own all of your land when you're a crop operation. But for those, in particular, livestock operations, all of that asset is owned, and it puts them in a much better position. The other thing that we have seen with our crop producers is that there was a large group who in 2012, when they had this increased cash flow, they tried to buy up land, pay cash for it, and not take out a loan, which is what has allowed that equity position to stay stable. That's also what allowed that solvency rate, so that red line, to go down. So a smaller portion of the farms in Minnesota are owned by creditors currently, the lowest that we've seen historically. So from my perspective, that's a good indicator. We might be able to weather negative profit for more than 3 years due to that. It also might mean that we'll have to look at some creative solutions to do that. The last sort of bar chart, just looking at all of our farms in general, is I wanted to show what family living expenses have done over the past few years. So around the late 90s, we traditionally saw family living expenses around $30,000. Adjusted to today, that's about $50,000. We saw a drastic increase around 2008, 2009. This is when a lot of people updated their house, did a bunch of other things because they had the extra cash flow available. We've seen that decrease substantially, but we had farms in our database saying that their family living expenses were over $120,000. And it's since decreased substantially, but a lot of that was tied to a new house, and they just categorized that as family living expenses. But that continues to come down. Okay, so now I just want to focus on Minnesota crop farms. So if you are across the border from Iowa or Wisconsin, I apologize, that data is not in this database, but the farms are relatively similar, so hopefully we can draw similar conclusions. So I just wanted to quickly pull up, this is identical to that first slide I showed you like this, but this is now just for our crop farms. I've taken out any of the livestock operations. And I just want to point out that last year in 2017, the average or the median net farm income for our crop producers was only $24,000. Looking at some of our health expenses for our farmers, that was pretty much all of their health, that covered their health insurance for the year. So we're very much aware that this is a very tight margin that many of our producers are working with. The lowest though that our crop producers in the state have faced was in 2014 when it was $17,000 was their net farm income. So 14 was worse than 17. Our 2018 numbers are going to start rolling in January, so all this will be updated in March, but we expect it to be lower. So not with this median net farm income, so this is a return to labor and management, but we do, for some of our estimates, say specifically that we've included a labor charge. We'll split that up by crop enterprise, which I'll show a little bit later, but our base is that you need $25,000 as your base labor, and then 5% of your gross sales is what your labor. This is just net farm income, not considering labor or management. So it's not in this one specifically. So we expect you to pay that $25,000. You'd be at zero, yes. So this is, remember that I showed that one slide where we saw that divergence sort of with our top 20% and our lowest 20% producers. This is showing that same information. It's just showing that our top 20% of our producers on average in 2017 made $198,000 in net farm income. Our lowest, our 20% of our producers made a negative $70,000 last year. So right there is that big divergence between those two categories. The people in the middle were around that 22 to 67,000. So it really just depends where you are in that spectrum. So I say that average is 25,000, but we have a lot of producers, 20% of them, who were making 200,000 on average last year. This is something that we like to call the goalpost figure, but the interesting thing about this result is that our lowest producers tend to be some of our largest producers, or our lowest performing. So we are seeing our small to medium-sized producers pretty much in the middle of the pack. And the producers that are either really doing great financially or not performing as well are our largest farms. So that's sort of the focus as to what is happening with that lowest 20%. So to figure out what is happening, we figured we'd look at some of the characteristics of the farm to see if we could identify specific characteristics that are pulling forward on that. So we'll see if this works. Okay. So when we look at that lowest 20% and that highest 20%, again, all this performance is just based on their net farm income. We don't see a lot of difference with their age or the average years of experience on the operation. So our lowest performers, average age was 53, highest performers, 49, and experience was 27 to 29 years. We do see a little bit of the difference in this crop size. So that lowest 20% has about 1,400 acres on average, whereas the highest performers have about 1,900. So they're still considered large. There's about a 600 acre difference between them. The more interesting difference is that percent of the crop acreage owned. So our lowest performers are paying a lot more in rent, which is what we're going to end up seeing because they don't own the land. And that probably at the end of the day is one of the biggest determining factors, right? Do you own the land or not? Our top performers own about 29% of it. Our highest performers perform better with yield and the price that they receive for their commodity. So what we do in our database is that we have our gross sales per commodity and our corn yield, and we divide that, and that's how we get the price that they're receiving. We do have some farmers that specifically report their contracts. It's just not consistent. So for this data, we reported the average using that calculation. But our lowest performers, there's about a 12 bushel per acre yield difference with corn, and they're losing about 15 cents, or missing the opportunity on 15 cents per bushel. However, and this is consistent across however we slice and dice this data, is our lowest performing farms financially tend to always outperform with soybean yield. They are better soybean producers than corn producers. So we don't necessarily know what's happening there, but it shows up consistently. However, they're still missing out the opportunity on the price. So our top farmers have learned how to get a higher price for the commodities that they're selling. I also pulled out some of their more specific financials so we could see the difference. So remember there was a 600-acre difference between these two groups. And there's about a $300,000 difference with their gross sales that they're bringing in. And then their median net farm income differs between that negative to the $200,000. Both of these farms, or both of these groups of farms, are liquid. As a lender, I would want to see this liquidity ratio, or that current ratio, greater than 2. So those top performing farms are at that threshold. A lot of this could be grain in the bin that they're storing, compared to our lower producing farms that may have sold this previously, so they're not recording it necessarily in the bin. Our top performers have a lot more money within that working capital also. So they have that $700,000 compared to only $60,000. And keep in mind, so working capital does include the grain that is in storage. So even if you're storing it at the elevator, it's still counted within that current working capital. So there's the differences there. In general, both firms are solvent, so that debt to asset ratio. So their lender owns less than 38% of their farming operation. So again, we want to see that threshold less than 40%. So our farms are solvent. I'm not worried with these numbers that too much of it is owned by a lender. That may change as people are taking on more operating loans. This is maybe the key difference between these two groups, our operating profit margin. So our top 20% of our producers, for every dollar of revenue that they're bringing in, they're keeping 18 cents on the farm as profit that they can choose to reinvest however they want. Our lowest performing farms, for every dollar of revenue that they're bringing in, they're getting another 14 cents from somebody else. So that's either through their operating their loans, their creditors, something along those lines. And that's where we start to get worried. We would like that number to always be positive. Can't happen every year, but operating loans can only float you for so long, and then you have to start selling land. Part of this is due to how their expenses are playing out. So we want to see an operating expense ratio of at least something less than 70 to 65%, depending on your type of operation. So if it's less than 70%, I know that 30% of my gross revenue can still be used to cover whatever my ownership costs. So our high performers have figured that out. They have enough money to cover their bills. 97% of the revenue coming in for our lowest performers is going all to operating expenses. So this isn't covering interest or anything else within that. Yes? Yeah, so the question was, is it a factor of like economies of scale or economies of size? The larger you are, you can spread more of this cost over. Traditionally, I would say yes, that is exactly what it is, but our lowest 20% has 1,300 acres compared to our highest that has 1,700 acres. So that $600 or 600 acres may or may not be tweaking that, but I think there's more going on with how they're managing their input costs. And I personally think a lot of it is coming to that rent expense and not negotiating it. That's where a lot of that is happening, because they own less of their land, so that I need to keep farming, I've bought this equipment, this is the price I have to pay. So it's taking a while to get that rent expense to come down. That was a good question. Any other questions? The other thing is the difference between their machinery investment, right? Which sort of gets to that other point. Our lowest performing farms have $682 of machinery investment per acre compared to our top 20% that only have 573. So I see that difference within there. Just sort of to get to your point, you were sort of jumping ahead a little bit, which is good, is I did split this out just for what we would categorize as our large farms. So that's anything over $1 million in gross sales for the year, just to sort of provide that comparison base. So roughly close in age. The one thing that I do want to point out is over $1 million in gross sales, at least for 2017, meant you had about 3,000 acres is what you were operating. There you own even less, and this is where that difference comes in with that rent expense. If you're in that lowest 20%, you only own 17% of your land compared to the top 20% that own a third. So that rent expense playing a big factor moving forward. The other thing is we still see our top 20% outperforming with yield. With corn, we don't see it with soybeans again. But then I also did put in wheat for this. The problem is we don't have, none of our lowest performing crop operations grow wheat. I shouldn't say that. We did not have 30 farms, so we were able to report it. That is what it is. So, but we had at least 30 farms within our top 20% that did incorporate spring wheat into their crop operation. So that was just one difference. We only saw that with those over $1 million in gross sales. We did not see that with less. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Just checking out time. Okay, so now I'm going to work, those were crop numbers averaged across all of Minnesota. Now I'm just going to focus on southern Minnesota. So this is the majority of the data coming from the Southwest Farm Business Management Association, and then the FBM instructors that work within this area. I'll stay around Rochester, Albert Lea, sort of west. So what I've done is I've split this out, looking specifically at corn and soybeans. So that's what I'm going to focus on moving forward. And we split it out by the type of, if they're a high cost, an average cost, which is in that middle category, or a low cost producer. And what is the interesting thing you see with this specific row right there? Does this seem to make sense to you? Our low-cost producers have a higher yield compared to our high-cost producers. And coincidentally, our low-cost producers also are in our top 20% of our top highest performers. So there is a large subset of low-cost producers in southern Minnesota who consistently are getting higher yields than their high-cost counterparts. So as an economist, I look at this, and I taught farm management for 8 years, and I'm like, oh, thank God someone was listening. They are applying fertilizer to the level at which they optimize their output, right? That sounded very academic-y, I know. But I talk to my students a lot about, does that extra pound of fertilizer actually get you an additional bushel to give, like, does that math work out? And it appears that there are a large number of farms in southern Minnesota who have done that math, figured it out, and they've stopped spending money on whatever combination of inputs to get them to that optimal point. So kudos to southern Minnesota for figuring that out, because I've used data from other states, and it always seems to be, let's put a little bit more on to see what we get. So we have significantly lower seed prices compared, $123 per acre compared to $112, which that can make a difference pretty quickly when you're looking at break even, lower fertilizer, lower chemicals, and lower rent. That rent differential is still pretty tight in southern Minnesota, but it is slowly moving down, which we like to see. Yep, so that's a really good question, is what is in that rent expense? Is it just the rented acreage, or is it you're charging a rent expense for your owned acreage? It is just the rent expense that you are paying somebody else. So we have another value in there that's called the land charge for what you own. So that would be like your principal payment or your interest. So this is what you are paying another entity to raise corn on that land. No, it's not. I didn't report. There's like 14 expenses in here. I just didn't report all of them. So we do have a separate land charge expense that is incorporated into this total cost. Like if you add up, you can't add up 123, 126 and get 800. So I just didn't put that all in there because I really didn't. That's the biggest criticism when an economist speaks is I throw 18 numbers at you in one list, but it's in there. So yes, we have it. Okay, so this is where we see a big difference, right? For our producers is $843 per acre compared to $672. So right there is that big differential. So I went ahead in the background and calculated the cost of production. I like looking at it from this perspective, so then I know what I need to contract my corn at in order to break even. No one wants to make $0 a year, I get that, but if I make $0, I don't have the lender knocking on my door asking me to sell land. So that is always my minimum goal, and then making more than that is always preferred, right? So if I'm a high cost producer in 2017, I needed at least $4.07 corn in order to break even. When did we have $4.07 corn? In 2017 or 2018? We have not. There are a few producers who pre-contracted and maybe were able to get that, but we have not. So our high cost producers are definitely in trouble. 2017, 2018, potentially 2019. Our low cost producers only need $3 per bushel. How often has that occurred in the market in the past 12 months? Has it went below $3? For a while, but they at least hopefully were not selling because they knew that they needed at least $3. But the low cost producer can still make money. These are the producers that reported $200,000 in 2017. Okay, so I just pulled the corn price actually for Albert Lee the other day. And it said that if you delivered in November, so I guess today, it was at $3.16. So I just wanted to show the comparison of our lowest producers were making 16 cents compared to everyone else. The highest producers were losing close to $1. So just something to keep in mind. These are the things that I look at to sort of draw those comparisons and see where can we make those adjustments. The other thing that I did is I pulled it out by size. So this is looking at acreage. So if you had 251 to 500 acres of corn, 1,000 to 1,500, and then 2,000 to 5,000 acres, to just show those size scale differences. So we still see our larger farms do have an increased yield. 226 compared to 214, but our larger farms are still also getting a better price for the product that they're selling. So to see that differential with their seed costs, so our 1,500 or less farms tend to be at a similar seed price. Our larger farms were able to get a price differential. A lot of that is due to the quantity in which they're purchasing as well. So some of those benefits are coming in there. But this is just illustrating another way to slice and dice this data. Quite honestly, I could cut it up in a bunch of different ways, so we're just trying to do it in a way that would be the most beneficial for you guys. The net return, when we're looking just across the size differentials, when we looked, this is all of the producers mixed together, so we could have top and lower performers in that high farm size category. Across all size categories, we had our producers losing money last year on a $1 per acre basis. So this is why we like to show it averaged across and then show that top and that lowest 20% to see those differentials. So now this is looking at what prices have been historically, and then what we do is we reach out to a bunch of our contacts within the state of Minnesota, but then also states across the country to figure out what we think 2018 prices were, and then project what we think 2019 would be. I know a lot of you guys are making these 2019 decisions right now, so just to sort of provide that basis. So seed we saw relatively stable, going down a little bit. We see fertilizer going up from the people that we have been chatting with. We see chemicals going up slightly, as well as fuel and drying costs. I will say, gas in St. Paul, Minnesota is still $2.55 compared to $2.25 in Albert Lea, so that was like a welcome surprise to be able to fill up my vehicle down here. But that's what we see happening with that. We still see rent going down, so this is the biggest expense that we're worried about with producers. Is it seems like a lot of rent is still at the 2012 level, and we're 6 years out of that now, and we need it to come back down to more of what crop prices are, what farmers are receiving. So it's still coming down slightly. But for 2019, we're estimating conventional corn to be about $730 per acre for input costs compared to $720 this year, is what our estimate is. Both are lower than 2017 though. So right now, this is maybe the opposite of the good slide that we have in here, is just showing what we have what we've heard. The yield can go anyway, right? We just sort of guessed, we put a number in there. But estimated corn price, $340, gross revenue about $650 per acre. If expenses are $700, we're looking at producers losing about $50 per acre on corn in 2019 with the estimates that we have right now. So not the best news, right? But at the same time, there are, I guarantee you, a large number of farms in this room who have their inputs managed in such a way where they will have a positive profit. So this is sort of the worst case scenario is what I'm showing you right now. The other thing that the other thing that we like to do is we like to create these sensitivity or scenario tables to show you, because every farm in here is different, right? So we have the dollar per bushel that you could receive for corn and your yield per acre. And this is where we use our projected expenses, where we do put in that return to labor and management. So this does include that labor charge. And at $3 corn, it doesn't matter how much you grow right now, we're anticipating that you will lose money in 2019. The way that you will is if you have 220 bushel per acre corn, we see you making about $39 per acre, or if we have $4 corn and 190 bushel yield, then producers tend to be in the black, right? So long-term average, you would think that corn would potentially be $4 per bushel. So if we could get to that point, producers would be in a much better position than they are currently. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I don't know. The markets change pretty quickly. So last year I was telling producers to plant soybeans, and we know how well that turned out. So I've learned not to say to do anything anymore. The one thing that we also do is look at what the average rent expense is within our database. So we're at $210 per acre is what the average is. So with $210, 190 bushel corn, you need $405, which is why I keep coming back to that $4 corn. It's really, if you can figure out how to get it, you should be okay. And then here we converted that labor charge to just $50 per acre. That's at $25,000 and the 5% of gross revenue. I also wanted to do a quick show this. If you are a low-cost producer, it is not as scary as the previous slide, right? If you have I guess again you need 220 bushel corn, but it's more realistic at 350. If you're that low-cost producer, that's your target right now for pricing whatever corn you potentially have in storage and you want to market. 350 is sort of your target at this point. If you can figure out how to get it, it would make sense to figure out how to market a portion of that. You should be breaking even and making some profit on that front. Our high-cost producers, I'm just going to jump ahead. You need 450 corn. You need an extra $1 per bushel in order to break even. So right now, if you guys know your numbers on the back of your mind and you're sort of figuring out where you match up, you sort of have those bounds as to where you need to be marketing your commodities. We did the same thing for soybeans. So here, the main difference with soybeans, we saw, price is pretty close. No one was really talking a lot about soybeans this fall with everything with the the market facilitation program. So the main difference we're seeing is rent expenses adjusting the most quickly for soybean acreage. I don't know if you're able to negotiate a different rental rate based on the crops that you're growing, but that's at least what we were hearing for 2018 and then projected for 2019. Total cost about $490 per acre for 2019 for soybeans compared to $496 the year before. So this February, we were out giving this talk, and soybeans was the only thing that was making positive profit in 2017, and now we're not seeing that. So we had a yield of 55 bushels per acre. Right or wrong, we estimated the price at $8.50. That is considering the fact that you would be getting the market facilitation program payment, but you're still at a net return of negative $24 per acre. Ignore what I just said. That does not include the market facilitation. Let me highlight this. Sorry, I did not say the word not in that last statement. I needed to. That price of $8.50 does not include the market facilitation payment. If it does, you break even and you're at $0. So the payment comes through, you're eligible, you've got all that paperwork filled out, you should be able to break even in 2019. Okay. Again, we have the sensitivity analysis. Here it's a little bit more optimistic story, I guess, maybe. I don't know, it's not, sorry. So historically, we've been between 50 and 60 bushels per acre. Minnesota has been in soybeans. We've really been excelling at it the past few years. At the highest yield, we'd still need $8 soybeans. More realistically, if you use a more conservative estimate of 50 bushels per acre, $9 soybeans is getting you about $4 per acre. So again, no one's going to be buying a brand new house with these prices, but you sort of have that break point for what you need when you're marketing this moving forward. When we look at the cost of production, when we're using that 55 bushels per acre yield, our break even is $209 is our rent expense average across all of our farms. So you need anywhere from, I'll say, $8 per bushel to about $11.50, depending on what your yield is, to break even with your soybeans. Okay. Any questions on this? So then I'm going to quickly talk about machinery cost, because this is one of those things that we're seeing popping up a little bit more with our producers. A lot of it has to do with producers, rightly so, improving their machinery lines in 2011, 2012, 2013, and then having prices consistently go down. So this is one of the target areas that we get asked a lot about. So my question to you guys is, in 2017, looking at corn production on rented ground, what % of total cost was the machinery cost? So it could be 9%, 14%, 18%, or 24%. So show of hands, how many people think it's A? 9% of total cost was machinery, okay. 14%? Just a few. 18%? Okay. And 24%? No one? Oh, no, a few on 24. Okay. Well, it is 18%. So machinery costs accounted for almost 20% of total cost last year. So outside of rent expense, this is another target area that we're looking at. So we just pulled what that machinery cost. Oh, yes, sorry.
Depreciation and repairs.
Depreciation and repairs, and then any type of lease payments if that was included in it. Yep. So we have the machinery cost per acre for corn right behind me. And for our farms between 250 to 2,000 acres, they're all pretty much grouped together right around $130 per acre is what that machinery investment is. Our largest farms had the lowest. Obviously, they could spread it over more acreage compared to our smaller ones where that cost was higher. We've seen this grow a lot. I don't want to put a specific number on it, but this is significantly higher than what we would see prior to 2008. We sort of see the swap. There were a lot more repairs and expenses prior to 2008, and this is composed more of those larger principal payments or lease payments, which don't always go match up. Soybeans were more consistent across, around about, what was it, $90 per acre, under 1,000 acres, and then our largest farms had the largest costs for soybean production. So I don't know, I don't think these large farms just don't seem to figure out soybeans as much as our smaller guys do. So the other thing that I just wanted to point out is the machinery investment divergence, and this was sort of what I was getting at before. Prior to 2008, we were around $250 to $300 per acre. Now we're all the way up to, let's see, $650 to $700 per acre. So we've either doubled or tripled this, depending on your operation in the past 10 years. Large increases, a lot of new paint on farms also due to that price run up. The thing that is interesting is that that red line is our lowest 20% of our farm performers, green is at highest. Our top performers in 2015 stopped buying equipment and they reverted back to repairs and maintenance. The farms that are in our lowest performing categories kept buying equipment. It does not mean that they are not good farmers. It just means that is part of the reason why they are in that lowest 20%, are these increased costs with this new machinery that's sort of pushing them over to that point. So when we saw these results, one of the regional extension educators, you guys might know him, Rob Holcomb, really wanted to see what are some of the characteristics of our top farmers, and could we sort of tie this across? So this is work that got started before I was hired at the U of M, but they've allowed me to jump on the bandwagon and help analyze the data. So I'm going to sort of tie this together to point out some of the key things, and then you guys get to have lunch, so it'll be great. Real quickly, education matters. So our lowest performers are on that where it says 1, our highest performers are over here. Maroon and black mean you have a college education. Maroon is you do not have an agricultural degree as part of your college education. The black solid box means that you do. We did not ask what their college degree was in agriculture. We just said ag, so it could be agronomy, crop and soil science, animal science, ag econ, any of the above. And then we have the goal as the highest education level attained was a high school education. We see our top performers, there is really no difference across this. We just see the difference in the composition of our farmers. So there are less farmers out there that just have the highest level of education as the high school education. There's a lot more that have went to traditional colleges and either got a 2 or 4 year degree in ag, and those tend to show up more often in that top performing group. The reason why there's more than getting a 2 or 4 year degree. I always tell my students it's more important to get life experiences sometimes than to sit in the classroom and get every answer right, because you learn a lot through that process. But if you are going to make a mistake, I'd much rather have you make the mistake on your exam than on your parents' or your grandparents' farm, right? Like that's part of what that education process is. We also wanted to look to see how many workshops our farmers were attending outside of the normal traditional education settings. So this would count. We'd also look at extension programming, any type of work with FBM instructors. So the solid box is those that were in the highest 20%. The dashed line is the lowest 20% of the performers. Going to these types of events definitely indicate that you are in that top 20%, or I would say that top 40%. So these type of educational opportunities are showing up as ways that sort of distinguish those top versus lowest performing farms. The last thing I want to talk about real quickly is how you market your crops. So we asked if you use pre-harvest contracts, cash sales, or post-harvest. The majority of our producers said that they used pre-harvest cash contracts. So you may have stored it at home in your own bin and delivered in January versus post-harvest. Post-harvest was defined as making a decision after harvest has been completed. We don't see, so top is on this side, our lowest performers are over here. We don't see a big difference between cash sales or pre-harvest contracts. The difference is our post-harvest contracts. Our top producers are figuring out how to market their commodity for a price greater than their break even with their post-harvest. Someone's gonna ask me why these percents add up to more than 100% or less than 100%. I know they do. Not everyone in our sample reported using these, so this is the average over those that reported a positive response, okay? So of those that used post-harvest contracts, they contracted 30% of their crop using that strategy, okay? So just keep that in the back of your mind. And then the last thing is how you started your farm actually matters a lot. Farms that had help from their parents, either just financially receiving help or starting a partnership with them, tended to be in our top 20% more often than the farms who did not have any help when they started their operation. So as some of you guys are thinking about transitioning your farm to the next generation, this seems to be the stepping point that allows them to move up to that next level compared to those that are just starting from scratch and trying to figure out how to do it. So I will be honest, I've been on a few calls. This has all been with Iowa, but they've had a bunch of dairy farms that all expanded in 2012, and they needed an outside perspective, so they had me look at their financials, and the banks were, I think, at the end of the day, going to pull the plug, which is always hard for me because that's not my job, right? I am in the business of keeping farmers in business, not telling them no. But they just expanded at the exactly wrong time, and they didn't own any land. They only had like 50 acres, and that's what really hurt them. But you know, it's figuring out sort of where your break even is. I do have. I sort of had a bunch of next steps, but you sort of bring up a good point. If you do need to negotiate your rent, there's some resources available online for you. I really encourage you to take a look at that. But when I do talk to lenders, this is what they told me is the determining factor between farmers that will get their operating loan and those that will not. And the first thing is knowing your cost of production and what you're going to market your crops at. So if you can go in and say, I know my break even is $3. I'm going to sell a quarter of my crop in January at this price, another quarter here, and another quarter here. It makes the lenders have confidence that you actually know what's happening. Their concern is, will you actually execute when that comes? So you sort of have to have a contingency plan and say, if the price is $2.75, I'm not going to sell a quarter. I'm only going to sell 20% because I'm going to hope that the price goes up, but then what happens if it goes down? So they want to have those discussions with you, and they're more likely, at least what they've said to me, to consider those operating loans for those producers on the line at that stage. So this is helpful. I don't know if this will be available online or not. The other thing that I actually get a lot of questions about, if you are concerned about your operating loan, something along those lines, we do have a lot of resources available. All these resources are free and confidential. I grew up on a dairy farm. My dad never asked for help. It's very hard as an entrepreneur and a farmer to ask for help, but if you do want someone to have a second look at some of the things that you're going through, these resources are all available. Not tied to any faculty members. These are all retired FBM instructors. They've all signed confidentiality forms, those types of things, but resources available. The one resource that most people don't know about is this Minnesota Family Farm Law. If you know of anyone that may be at the brink of potential bankruptcy, doesn't matter how long they've been in operation, this is a great resource for them. They can help them talk through ways to potentially avoid bankruptcy. So just have this stuff available if you need it. Not necessarily you, but if you know someone else that does.